minister of the Burmese government in exile, monks, and friends. I did go to Burma the first time in 1980, like a stupid tourist, as we so often are, all of us. And I'd spent quite a bit of time already in different parts of Asia. And I was overwhelmed by the experience because, on the one hand, it was obvious. I'd read a great deal about Burma, first of all, and so I understood that this was one of the naturally rich countries of the world, that it had been one of the richest countries in the world. It had a long history, an imperial history, a mixed history with its relationships over the centuries with its neighbors, but a very powerful country. And even under British colonial rule, it had been, in economic terms, an incredibly rich country. The rice basket of Asia, one of the greatest exporting nations of Asia. And you could see the remains of that as you went around Burma, looking at it with a critical eye. You could see what there had been before the British, what there had been during the British, what there had been in that brief period after the British, before the first coup. And then you saw the reality of how the country was being run, that it had been driven into the ground in not an interesting way. I mean, excuse me for being ironic about dictatorships, but there are many kinds of dictatorships in the world. Some of them are actually, even though I'm a Democrat and I'm against dictatorships, you have to look at some of them and say, well, that's quite a successful dictatorship. Or sometimes there's a soft monarchy that isn't a democracy, and say, well, I would prefer it to be a democracy, but there's a certain amount of prosperity, there's a certain amount of freedom of speech. But what I saw in 1980, looking around Burma, was an incredible waste, a waste of people's lives, a waste of potential, a waste of sophistication, a waste of a history, a country which had been driven into poverty by the stupidity of its leaders. And I think, we've heard over, in my brief time, 26 years, 28 years knowing Burma, we've already heard how many names for how many reinventions of this dictatorship. But of course, it's actually into its, 45th, 46th years of existence. Since 1962, when the first coup d'etat happened, the country has essentially been in the hands of the same kind of mediocre, stupid, self-interested, unimaginative leadership.
No, I was in Pride.
These are people who aren't terribly bright.
The other people that
they don't have any real ambitions. They don't really have a desire to take Burma somewhere. They don't even want it to be grand in the way that some dictators would like their countries to be grand. They just want to be in power. They don't know how to make money. They don't know how to make the economy work. The best they've been able to do in the last 20-odd years was when the Thais realized that they were running out of their teak, and that was a disaster. The Thais shut down their teak industry because they'd done a deal with these Burmese dictators to get the Burmese teak. And the thing they were doing was they were getting the Burmese teak dirt cheap out of Burma, so that the Thais were making the profit on the back of the Burmese people because of the stupidity of the Burmese dictators. And I see the monks nodding. I'm not making this up. I mean, I can't think of a single regime in the world which is as mediocre and low level as this regime. So quite beyond, or beneath, I should say, the appalling treatment of the Burmese people, what happens each time the Burmese people go into the streets, as periodically they have the courage to do, what the non-existent freedom of speech. Putting all of that aside, they're not even good as dictators. And it's important to say that, because when you say that, you understand what you're dealing with, and you have to understand, the Burmese here know this, the Burmese Canadians know this, but I think it's important to say it for any of you who haven't been there, who haven't seen it. You're dealing with a very particular case here, a very particular kind of leadership, of which I don't think there is any other repetition in the world today. One might say North Korea, but even North Korea is better run than Burma, even North Korea. So when we hear, and in the last 25 years, every 5 to 10 years, people in the West get hope that there will be change. I mean, even in Canada, I see it. Some politicians or some of our diplomats, suddenly there seems to be a bit of an opening up. And of course, the reason there seems to be a bit of an opening up is because the regime in Burma has reached the point of no return. It can't even hang on at this lowest possible level. So, for a very brief period of time, they make what I would call not even minor concessions, minute concessions, and they make a point of suddenly talking to Westerners or talking to the Japanese or talking to the Chinese, making vague promises that they're going to do this, and there's going to be a constitution, or there's going to be an election, or they're going to open up to tourism, and then there's a little discourse about, well, if we let the tourists in and we have some investment, then the money will trickle down to the people. And in the West, or in China, or in Japan in particular, people say, gosh, maybe they've changed. And just when we're on the edge of having, in a sense, finished with this regime, we relax, we let go, we allow some money in, and of course the money that goes in goes straight into the pockets of the regime and goes straight back out again into their Swiss bank accounts, or wherever they have those accounts. But they're not even selfish in that sense. They're not even stupid enough to be really rich dictators. They only make a couple of million at a time, as opposed to your real serious dictator who thinks about hundreds of millions. These are very, very minor characters out of very bad novels, except that they kill people. So what's dangerous in this endless battle, because most of the people in this room were born after this regime came to power. What's dangerous is these periodic moments of hope. I remember when I went to live in Ottawa, it was one of those little moments of hope, and I remember people from official Ottawa coming to see me off the record, as was done, and saying, now be careful because there's a hope of a breakthrough. And I said, look, there's no hope of a breakthrough. There is no breakthrough possible with these people. It will not happen. And, about a year later, we were talking, and they agreed there was no breakthrough possible. And I remember the first New Year's that I was in Government House, when my wife was head of state, there's a reception, and all the ambassadors come from all the countries. And, it's a very apolitical position, Rideau Hall. And there they are, 150 ambassadors lined up, and you go around and you say good evening, Happy New Year, best wishes. And as I was going down the line, I suddenly realized that the Burmese ambassador was there. And I can't shake hands with this man. He's a murderer. And I said to the ambassador, the head of protocol, who was ahead of me, and I didn't have time to say it to my wife, I said, just beware, I'm not going to shake his hand. So I got to him, and I took a step back. He had his hand out, looking expectant and happy. And I walked by him, and then I walked back in and shook the hand of the next person. The next year he came again, and the same thing happened. And the third year he was sick.
Free Tibet, too.
And he's been sick ever since. And the only reason I tell you the story is that even in the smallest detail, there is no room for compromise with these people. This is something which I believe the United Nations Special Envoy, Mr. Gambari, doesn't understand. I don't know the man. I don't know anything about him, except that he seems to think he's having a conversation with this regime. He seems to think that he's negotiating. And he's recently stated in Singapore that there is the hint of hope, because the junta have told him that they're considering, this is one of those moments, they're in trouble. So they consider opening up, they consider a change of direction. Perhaps, they're going to have a referendum, and then perhaps they'll have a constitution, and then they'll have an election. It's exactly